I'd like to welcome everyone to Salado United Methodist Church. I'm pastor here. My name is David Mosser, and I'm in my fourth year now. And what we do weekly is have a Bible study. Generally, we do it on the Revised Common Lectionary, but during the next probably close to 2 months, we're going to pick up for the most part in the Abington uh, uh, Bible Study Teacher's Guide. This comes from another kind of lectionary. It's called the International Lesson Series, and it's used by many churches. So we're using those texts right now because those are the texts that I'm trying to study closely. Um, Today, what I thought we would do is talk about the Gospel of Mark in sort of a generic way and work from the middle of Mark until we get down to Mark 14:27, which will be our lesson when we get to Friday. We will start with that tight text and work on that. But from now, for the moment anyway, we're going to be a little generic and talk about Mark's gospel. Now, as you probably know, if you're any kind of New Testament scholar at all, that Mark is the second of four gospels that we have in the New Testament. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in that particular order in our canon right now. Over the years, over the centuries, in fact, the order of the Gospels have been changed to one extent or another, so each one of them has a different place in the corpus of four. But for now, we have Matthew, then we have Mark, then we have Luke, then we have John. Even though Mark is placed second in the New Testament, most scholars believe that Mark was the first of the Gospels that was written. It's the shortest Gospel, and it is the most direct of the Gospels. You find very few parables in Mark. You do find some, but they're very few, maybe 5 or 6 at the most. And Mark finishes his gospel in a much more surprising way than do the other three gospels. Now, Mark wrote his gospel, most scholars believe, around 70 CE or Common Era. Since we live in a world today that is not simply just Christian, what we have are people from all kinds of different faiths, and so instead of saying AD or BC, before Christ, after Christ, what we do instead is we call it the Common Era, which would still be the same time frame. AD that we use for after Christ means Anno Domini, which means after Christ, of course. So Mark wrote his gospel around 70, and we think this is true because mostly Mark is writing to people that would have lived in the arena of time where the temple was destroyed. There was a Jewish revolt it was probably almost 200 years after the Maccabean revolt. And this Jewish revolt in the first century was between 66 and 73. And finally, Titus, who was the Roman emperor of the time, had a belly full of these rioting Jews. And so what he did was he burned the temple to the ground. Now, I know that Jesus in chapter 13 of Mark talks about the stones of the temple being torn down, but the real truth was that the temple was destroyed by fire by the Romans. And it was a very cataclysmic time for the Jewish people because the temple was the dead center of religious life in Judaism in the first century and before that too. This would have been the second temple, the temple that was built after the exiles came back from Babylon, and they built it, and it was revered. It was a truly magnificent building. It was gigantic compared to almost all the other buildings in a place like Jerusalem, and it was one that was deeply revered. And it's why these sort of hillbillies from Galilee, which we call the 12 disciples, were so impressed with the temple and say so in some of the texts in Mark's gospel. Now, the Jewish people wanted to overthrow the Romans. They had gotten enough of the Romans running everything in their country, and so there were insurrections and revolts all over the place. And finally, Titus just decided, I've had enough, and he completely ruined the temple. And in this way, he robs the Jewish people of their greatest religious institution in the whole country. So it would be the equivalent of a foreign invader coming in and taking out the United States' Pentagon and White House and some other gigantic buildings that are very symbolic of America. And so the audience for whom Mark is writing tend to be the Jewish peasants. Some scholars believe that that is why it's written in what's called Koine or Common Greek, so that these peasants could understand the story that Mark was trying to tell them. Now, when I talk about scholars say this or scholars say that, what I want you to know is that I generally take the consensus of scholarship. What do most scholars agree is the truth of one matter or another? There's obviously always disagreements among scholars about different details, but generally speaking, most scholars believe that the audience are the Jewish peasants in Palestine or in Israel or Judah. One other thing that seems to throw people when they're talking about the Gospel of Mark is that sometimes it's difficult to sort of ferret out what the symbols that Mark is using, what they mean. What do they mean then? What do they mean now to us? And one of the things that I want to point out that I think is very important, and it is a key, in my opinion, and many others, about how to understand Mark, is that the fig tree is something that symbolizes the temple. And so Jesus, on his way to the temple one day, Jesus and the disciples come into Jerusalem in about chapter 11, and on their way to the temple, Jesus sees a fig tree, and he goes over to it to get figs, and it has no figs. And so Jesus curses it, and then goes on to the temple. And when they come back later, the fig tree has withered and died. Now, sometimes people wonder, why would Jesus do this, curse a fig tree which had no say in whether it produced figs or not? It's just an element of nature. Why would Jesus become so irritated or irked or annoyed at the tree that he would, in essence, kill it? And one of the things that scholars point out is that the fig tree represents or is symbolic of the temple. The temple, being so important, was to provide for prayer and worship for the Jewish people, just like a fig tree was created to provide figs for the people. And what happens is that the religious authorities, the temple scribes and lawyers, and those who were in charge of the temple's treasury had shirked their duties and their responsibilities. They had promised one thing and not delivered. They had lied to the people over and over again. and promised them things that they refused to provide. And so when Jesus talks about throwing the mountain into the lake or into the sea, and he was probably speaking of the Mediterranean Sea, which is not too far from Jerusalem, what he is saying is the Temple Mount, the mountain or the big hill upon which the temple was built, would be plucked up by God and thrown into the ocean and completely destroyed. What this does for Jewish people is it allows them access to God directly without having to go through the temple religious apparatus or the temple's guardians, which had not been fulfilling their task, which was to provide for the religious needs of the people. In other words, they were abusing the people in the sense that they were taking money from them and really shaking them down in a way. And so Jesus is always opposed to the temple in the Gospel of Mark. And the destruction of the temple opens up a way for Jewish people to have direct access with Yahweh or with God. Now, I use this analogy, and I use it not to insult the Roman Catholics, but in the early 1500s, Martin Luther tacked his 95 Theses to the door at the church in Wittenberg. And one of the things that Luther was against was indulgences. But another thing that Luther was against was that common, ordinary lay people could not have access to God unless they went through their local friar or priest or bishop or cardinal or the Pope or anything that had to do with the Vatican. And Luther called this sort of dogma or doctrine, he called it the priesthood of all believers, which meant that people could pray directly to God, or that other believers could pray on the behalf of their friends or neighbors or family without having to have access to the religious establishment. And so in a like way, this is why the fig tree and the temple needed to go, because they had failed in their duties to help the common people of Palestine in the first century pray to God directly or to worship God directly. There was no intermediary, there was no middle person in between the lay people and God. And so the fall of the temple, if you read the Gospel of Mark carefully from beginning to end, talks about the fall of the temple. It's one of the, if not the principal theme of the Gospel of Mark. Now, when we get to chapter 11, what happens here is that Jesus and the disciples enter into Jerusalem. As you will remember from some of our earlier sessions, if you were with us, that Jesus and the disciples begin their ministry in Galilee, close to a place called Capernaum. They were all the way in the north by the Sea of Galilee, which is very near the Syrian border. It's as far north as you can go in Palestine. And so they trickle down, they wander, they walk, they teach, they worship. Jesus does miracles. Jesus does healings. They, that is the disciples and Jesus, work their way down over the course of about 3 years until they get to Jerusalem. And Jesus enters Jerusalem, the holy city as it was even then, on a day that we call Palm Sunday. And so I want you to know that. And so when they get to Jerusalem, on their way to the temple the first time, Jesus sees a fig tree. And I just told this story. He wanted figs. It didn't have any. It irritated him. He cursed the fig tree. And when they come back from the temple to go over to Bethany, which is kind of their staging area, the disciples noticed that the fig tree has withered from the roots up, which basically means Jesus had killed this fig tree. Jesus is opposed to the temple. If you look at a map of Jerusalem then, even today, there's a valley called the Kidron Valley, which runs between Jerusalem and Bethany. And they transverse that valley as they go back and forth from Bethany to Jerusalem and the temple, and then back to Bethany and so forth. The Kidron Valley lets us know that there is a gulf between Jesus and what he represents, which is basically the pure, unadulterated kingdom of God, and what the temple represents, which is something that has become, well, not what it should be. It's illegitimate in the eyes of the truly religious in the first century, and so it has to go, and in fact, it does go. Jesus curses the fig tree, and by that he curses the temple, but the Romans take care of the temple and they burn it to the ground. After that, beginning in chapter 12, Jesus tells a parable of the farmers or the tenants. In this parable, the Sadducees and other religious authorities think that Jesus aims right directly at them. And the reason that they think that Jesus aims this parable right directly at them is because Jesus aims this parable right directly at them. The parable goes that there was an owner of a piece of property, and so he sends several servants to go and collect the rent, which probably would have been paid in produce. I can't remember off the top of my head whether it was wheat or olive oil or figs or what, but whatever it was, the tenants of this farm that was not owned by them sent the servants that the master had sent to collect the rent back with their tails between their legs. They beat them, they scourged them, they mocked them, and they sent them back. Finally, the owner of the vineyard decides that he will send his son, thinking to himself, thinking wrongly as a matter of fact, that these tenants will respect the son. Well, when the son gets there, the tenants rise up, kill the son, and throw him over a wall. And so after that, we have a series of conflicts between Jesus and the religious authorities. The first thing the Pharisees do is ask Jesus in public, and these are all controversies that are intended to trip Jesus up in public so that he may be arrested for sedition. So the first thing the Pharisees ask is it lawful or not to pay taxes to Caesar? If Jesus says yes, then the Jewish people will think that he's thrown in with the Romans. If he says no, the Romans will see him as a rabble-rouser and arrest him. And so what Jesus does is he says, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, render to God what is God's, which is kind of a classic non-answer to their specific question. The next group of people are the Sadducees, and they ask Jesus some long, convoluted, hypothetical question about the resurrection, which is interesting because the Sadducees don't even believe in the resurrection, but they say, look, there's a man and a wife, and the husband dies, and according to Levirate marriage, the woman is to marry the next closest kin. Well, it turns out the first man that was married to this one woman had 6 other brothers. And so in succession, this woman marries first brother number 1, he dies. Brother number 2, he dies. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, they all die. So the question is, whose wife will she be in the resurrection? And Jesus basically laughs it off, implying that since you don't believe in the resurrection, this isn't really truly a story. And besides, don't you think this woman is kind of bad luck? I mean, after all, everybody she marries dies. So she is the consummate black widow of Palestine. After that particular controversy, the religious authorities asked Jesus what is the most important commandment, and he, quoting Deuteronomy and Leviticus, tells them what he sees as the most important commandment, which is love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. So that is encapsulation of what the law is for the Hebrew people. Then we have the story of the widow's contribution. Now, you remember I said a moment ago that Bethany was opposed to Jerusalem and the temple, separated by the Kidron Valley. Well, Jesus sat opposite of the treasury, which would have been in the temple, and he sees a woman put in some small change for an offering, and he basically praises her generosity, because even though she didn't put large sums like the religious authorities did, she was very poor. So in terms of percentage, she gave at a much more sacrificial rate. At the end of that story, we get to Mark 13, which is called the Apocalypse of Mark. And what it does is it talks about the end times. It talks about the signs that one can look for the end times. And it also explains to the disciples why they can't know everything. They ask Jesus, when will be the signs of this happening? And Jesus basically says, no one knows. The angels don't know. Even I don't know. Only God knows. And so what he's saying is that God is responsible for the consummation or the ending of human history. Then he says, from the lesson of the fig tree, and he basically says, look at the fig tree. When it's summer, the leaves will shoot, and you will see leaves on the tree, and at other times you won't. And then at the beginning of chapter 14, which is where we're going to start the next time we get together on Friday, there was a woman who was anonymous that came in and broke a jar of alabaster perfume, and Mark tells us that she anointed Jesus' body for burial, which, as it turns out, will be the next day. And after that story, we have the story of the Jewish Seder meal, or the Passover meal. And this is the story that we find in Exodus 12, where the Lord tells Israel how to prepare for the meal. They're to sacrifice a certain kind of goat or lamb. If their house is too small for one of those, they should join with their neighbors. And they take the blood and they put the blood on the lintel and over the doorpost, so that when the angel of death flies over, and this is the 10th plague, by the way, that happens to the Egyptians, when the angel of death flies over Egypt and slays the firstborn of every family grouping that there is, that the angel of death will see the blood and will pass over these Jewish houses. And so just as soon as they are done with that particular meal, then something interesting happens, which leads us into our next lesson, which will happen on Friday. It said, when after they did that, then it tells us, when they had sung the hymn, they went to the Mount of Olives. And the Mount of Olives, of course, is a prayer garden, which is on the Bethany side of the Valley of Kidron. And so it too is opposed to the temple. And there it is, Jesus prays, and we will have a up close and personal look at what that time of prayer will be for Jesus and his disciples. I'd like to thank you for being with us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.